welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest has written numerous horror short story collections, has written the nonfiction book The Business of Short Stories, and is now a novelist as last week her first novel, Mythstalker Wendigo Nights, was released. Her name is Shannon Lawrence, and here's my interview with Shannon. Shannon Lawrence, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you. Hi.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. I was primarily a short story author and primarily horror. And I am now releasing my first urban fantasy novel, Mythstalker Wendigo Nights. And I'm also a podcaster. I do a true crime, cryptid, paranormal, but mostly true crime podcast called Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem. And by day, I am just a bookkeeper, bean counter, along those lines.
Without spoiling too much of your upcoming book, Mythstalker Wendigo Nights, which will be published after this, I should say it'll be published before this episode is uploaded, but it's not out at the time the interview this is being recorded. What will your book be about?
So it follows Selena, she's a myth stalker, and it's somebody who's kind of born into having the training and ability to hunt down creatures of Native American lore. And in this one, of course, it's in the title, she's hunting down a Wendigo. But it's complicated because somebody she cares for has been taken over by a Wendigo spirit, and she's trying to find the sire, basically, to see if she can save this person. But as far as she and her mentor and anybody she knows know, there is no way to reverse it once Wendigo has started taking over somebody's soul. So that's what she's up against.
Is Mythstalker Wendigo Nights going to be part of a larger series, or is it a standalone book?
It is going to be part of a series. So there'll be different creatures. And I have a couple different, it's not just the Wendigo in this. There's a brief encounter with something else and mentions of other critters because it's her life, and the people that she's around, it's their lives too. So lots of good little critter bits in there because, I grew up liking those things. Like you run into Sasquatch first, right? Bigfoot. You learn about Bigfoot first. And that leads to all kinds of lake creatures and all these other great cryptids. And a lot of Native American lore kind of blurs the boundary between cryptids and other types of creatures and various paranormal. So it's fun to get to visit some of these things that I grew up hearing about.
You've written a nonfiction book titled The Business of Short Stories. Without spoiling too much of that book, what is it about?
So I actually built up my author business with those short stories, which is not something that nobody's ever done. For example, Ray Bradbury was all short stories until somebody came to him and said, "You have a lot of short stories about Mars. How about putting together a novel that kind of ties those threads together?" And that's where you got the Martian Chronicles. And so I'm not alone. Stephen King writes a lot of short stories but yeah, it's rare though. And when you go to writers' conferences and the like, everything they're talking about is aimed at novels. So I was kind of instrumental in changing that in my local writing conference and letting people know that it's valid to write short stories. And so, yeah, I built up my author brand and all of that on short stories, and was getting to play with the big guys, I guess you could say, as not a novelist. And so after over a decade of doing that, I put together this book to let people know that there's not just one path to follow. And short stories and novels aren't your only paths, like nonfiction, journalism, all of that. There's a lot of options in writing, and we tend to funnel people into one. So I wanted to let people know there was something else out there. There's something else you can do. You can do it hand in hand, short stories and novels and whatever else. And then I put a big old chunk in there about marketing because I did because none of us like it. None of us like marketing unless you're an actual just there's okay, I'm not going to say none. There's probably a handful of people who love the marketing part, and that's great, but most of us don't. And so I wanted to put some information in there. I do have a business degree and I did an emphasis in marketing. So I felt like I could kind of make an easily digestible portion, and that portion in the book is good for any writer. It's not just about short story writers, though I do hit some points on that. But yeah, the marketing portion's all writing.
You've written numerous short stories, including the short stories featured in 4 collections you've written: Happy Gala Days, Happy Gala Days 2, Bruised Souls and Other Torments, and Blue Sludge Blues and Other Abominations. Without spoiling too much of each collection, is there an overarching theme to each collection? And if so, what is that overarching theme of each collection?
So the two Happy Gula Days and Happy Gula Days 2 are both holiday themed and not just Christmas. So I cover, let me see. Now I'm trying to remember. There's been a passage of time now, but Happy Gula Days 1 started, I think Thanksgiving is the first short story, and it's inspired by the Telltale Heart. And it ends, I want to say, on Valentine's Day. So I've got short stories for all the holidays between Thanksgiving and Valentine's. And then the Happy Gula Days 2 hits everything in between. If I remember right, the first story is St. Patrick's Day on that one. And then it goes through Halloween. So it culminates at Halloween. But so those ones are, of course, heavily themed with the holidays. And my other two really aren't. They're just a mix of horror. I will say that Blue Sludge Blues has more of kind of the harder horror monsters, that sort of thing. And Bruised Souls is has more psychological horror in it. And so there is a slight theme in those, but nothing heavy, and there is a mix. So there'll be some psychological and Blue Sludge and vice versa.
Aside from your own collections, what are some publications that have printed your short stories?
I was in Dark Moon Digest a few times. I'm gonna throw out, what is it? The Society of Misfit Stories, I think, because I've just learned that Bards and Sages, which was the overarching publisher there, is closing down. So a nod to them. I've been in Space and Time magazine. I've been in a variety of magazines. And I've also been in anthologies. So those ones were just under various publishers.
What drove you to write horror short stories?
I just love them. And I think it started when I was pretty young, and they had these great short story collections for, I'd say, middle grade. And so, late elementary, middle school type. I did not read scary stories. Scary stories tell in the dark. I know that's one that people would have heard of a lot. I didn't read that back in the day, but they had a bunch of other ones. And I would just, once I discovered them, I ate them up. And then I moved on, of course, to Stephen King. My dad had shelves full of King, and I think he's a master of the short story. I think he's phenomenal at writing short stories, and they've built a lot of his career because a lot of the movies he's had movies made off of both short stories and novels. So I just really enjoyed reading those, and I think that horror really lends itself to being in short form. And it's kind of addictive when you get to writing short stories and submitting short stories. There's just this process, and it's constantly going, and you're working on one thing. You're writing one thing or multiple things in my case at one time, and you're editing multiple things, and you're submitting multiple things. And sometimes you'll have a bunch of publications come out in the same month, and sometimes you'll have a dry spell of months where nothing comes out. But it's it's exciting, and it's this cyclical thing that you're constantly in this kind of rolling along in this loop. And so it's a lot of fun. Kind of novel writing takes longer, it's slower, it's more concentration on one thing instead of diving into all these different worlds all the time. So both of them have a beauty to them and drawbacks, of course. But yeah, I just really love horror in general. And, I enjoy movies, horror films, and stuff like that. My grandma got me into those early. So it just it was natural for me as somebody who'd been reading it and watching horror and all of that for so long.
Regarding Mythstalker, the business of short stories, and your own short story collections, are those all self published, traditionally published, published by a hybrid press, or did you use different methods for each book?
So all of my books are self-published. I figured I was getting all these short stories published and somebody else in general, most of that you're getting a specific payment in the beginning and that's it. And then somebody else is making money off of your stories. And that's fine because of course I want these magazines and these publishers to thrive. It's sad whenever another one shuts down, but then you get your rights back. So each short story that you write, you sign a contract and they take rights for a certain amount of time. And once I got them back, I was like, well, now what? They had this little run in this one magazine. And so I started bundling them together. I mean, they'd been approved by a publisher, they'd been through any editing. And so I had that back and I figured I'd bundle them together and put out my collections. And then it would be me who would be actually making something off of my stories. So, and it's kind of double dipping, right? But you can also sell reprints. So you can be triple dipping. But yeah, it was just made sense for me to do that. And instead of going through a publisher again on a short story collection with short stories that had already been through traditional publishing, I wanted that control. I mean, admittedly, I'm a bit of a type A there, but I wanted that control over my creations. And so, yeah, I kept that instead of again giving a chunk to somebody else.
On your author website, you promote the Insecure Writers Support Group.
Yeah.
What is the Insecure Writers Support Group? How often and where does it meet? And can any author join the group?
Oh yeah. So Insecure Writers Support Group it's this great group of bloggers. And it started years ago when blogging was in a little bit more of its heyday. But it was created by a sci-fi author named Alex J. Kavanaugh. And it's just a monthly blog hop, basically. Though people can participate on social media too. They have ways to do that. And their website is, I just think it's www.insecurewritersupportgroup, but.com. But you can go to alexjkavanaugh.com too and get to it. Anyway, it's a blog hop that happens every month, and it's the first Wednesday of every month. And you just post something about your insecurities, or you post information to other writers. It can be anything you're feeling. There's also an optional question each month, kind of to help people if, say, they're not feeling particularly insecure that month. But it's a good place. It started out as just this place to be like, man, this is what's hard in the writing world, or this is what's messing with me right now, or what I'm concerned about or feeling bad about. And it grew from there. And I don't know how many people are participating now. It's fallen off now because fewer people are blogging, but there's still over 100. I just don't know how many in particular. I was one of the people working in that group for a while, but now I'm just a participant. But yeah, anybody can join. And again, you can see even how to participate on your social media. But in general, it's a blog hop. So yeah, it's just a conversation. You go around on that first Wednesday and you visit some of the other participants. Most people can't get to all of them, but you visit some of them and you probably get some favorites and you guys kind of have a conversation and comments and posts to each other. So it's just a nice community. And it's a community that is incredibly supportive outside of this blog hop as well. And they actually have books that they put out now. They do short story anthologies that people can submit to. And yeah, so it's grown. It's just a big support network for writers, would be the most basic way to put it now that I rambled, but it's a good group of people.
One final question. You mentioned this a little bit at the beginning of the interview, but you host a podcast called Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem. What can listeners expect from a typical episode of your podcast?
So I have a co-host named MB Partlow, and in general, I guess you could expect, so we are two Gen X women, and we came together during COVID to create this podcast because we had been actually hosting live events before that for a local writers group called Pikes Peak Writers. And suddenly COVID shut everything down. We moved those live events to Zoom, of course. And we were just trapped in our homes. We're both moms. We both had kids. I think, well, I had kids home at the time. I had a high schooler and a middle schooler. And I think she might have had a high schooler and a college student. So, yeah, we decided we wanted to do something and be social and still get to talk to people. And after we stepped down from our position with those live events, we started this podcast. And we just hang out. Each of us tells a story, a true crime story, or if we found something interesting paranormal that didn't get debunked the moment that we started looking into it, we'll talk about that, or a cryptid. There's a lot of fun cryptids that I had never heard of before, like Sinkhole Sam is one. And we also have a guest each time, and that guest is a published author, and they also then tell a story in that same theme as the other ones. And again, it usually leans toward true crime for most of the stories, but not all of them. So, um, yeah, just two animated women who were stuck at home and now just enjoy continuing to do it now that that's not so much true anymore. And we chat and hang out. And I guess we're like, you should be prepared. If you don't like cussing, maybe don't listen to it. But we're just kind of speak freely and hang out and have a good time.
Shannon, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an amazing guest.
Thank you. Good questions. Thank you.
Shannon was an amazing guest to interview, and I love interviewing multi-talented authors like Shannon. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.